Thank you, Purva, for inviting me for this really prestigious Mumbai Dialogue on World Affairs. Thank you, Supriyata, who is not here. And thank you, Yashwantrao Chan Center, for inviting me today to talk about India's cybersecurity challenges. Uh, and thank you for all the audience who I have heard repeatedly, that they are really interested in hearing more about this particular topic. So what I'm going to do today is basically look at first the geopolitical context in which this entire cybersecurity challenges are evolving. Then I'm going to look at India's cyber threat landscape. Then look at what kind of policy responses and challenges India has undertaken in response to the cyber threat, and finally end with India's cyber diplomacy. But before I begin, let me just first talk about these two cyber attacks which you may have heard about, which happened in recent years. The one which happened in last December, November, basically was a ransomware attack on the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, right? This particular attack was suspected to be carried out by the Chinese hackers, and it was a ransomware attack. Ransomware basically means that hackers get into your system and they lock the entire system. And in return to regain their access to that kind of data, you have to pay a ransom. Okay, most of the times this ransom is in cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin and those kind of things. So imagine, for instance, in a physical setting, you are out of your house, and then you want, and when you're out, someone basically locks your house, takes the keys, and when you demand access to your house, that person basically is taking ransom for you to regain the entry. That is the thing which happens with the ransomware attack. But interesting in this particular case was that even though it is termed as a ransomware attack, in a sense they locked the entire systems, there was no ransom demand which was made. And that's very peculiar with this cyber attack. So what was the exact intention of the hackers to gain access to that kind of data? We'll come to that later. The second attack that I want to talk about is an attack which we in Mumbai actually faced in October 2020, when there was an extended blackout for more than 8 to 12 hours, right? That was basically because of the malware which was inserted by the Chinese hackers into India's power grid. Interesting, because the attack was actually notified by one of the US cybersecurity companies called as Recorded Future, and the company actually noted that this attack has been persistent. So in October 2020, there was a breach of the Indian power sector here in Mumbai, and then again last year, they said that a similar kind of an attack has happened in the power grids in Ladakh, where basically our military is fighting with the Chinese military on the line of actual control. Besides the power sector, Recorded Future also said that some parts of Indian port sector, so for instance JNPT, as well as some parts of railway infrastructure, were also compromised in this particular kind of attacks. So these two attacks, this AIMS ransomware attack and the attack on the Indian power sector, are basically a reflection of the global trend where hackers which are supported by the state actors, okay, adversarial states such as China, Russia and all that, they are targeting your computer networks and therefore trying to coerce you into doing something. And that is basically the geopolitics of the cyberspace. But before I talk about the geopolitical context, I want to talk briefly about the role of technology in international politics. Today, if you follow international politics, if you look at the latest international developments, you would see that technology has, in a sense, become a driver of international relations, right? That basically means that it is, in a sense, defining your politics, it is defining security, and defining economics. And there are two proposals of two developments which, in a sense, demonstrate the role of technology. One is this idea of a D10, or democracy's 10, which was floated by the former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said that democracies need to come together to create an alternative supply chain of 5G and other kinds of technologies, so that they can reduce their over-reliance and over-dependence on China. So that was the concept of D10, and eventually he did convene a summit of the democracies in UK in 2021. And there is another concept called as techno-democracies. Techno-democracies is basically countries with top technology sectors, advanced economies, and a commitment to liberal democracy. So similar to D10. So in this particular category, you can include US, UK, France, Germany, India, Israel, also Japan, South Korea, Australia. So these are the kind of countries need to come together, and they should create, basically focus on the technology collaboration. So that is how technology, in a sense, has become the main driver of international relations. There are many students of international politics here today. So if you recall, there is a Treaty of Westphalia, which basically defines the international system. And in a sense, technology is also, in a sense, challenging this Westphalian international system, because it is challenging national sovereignty, and it is also, in a sense, creating new challenges for the nation states. So that is one role of technology. But if you look at the cyberspace is also creating new challenges for the international politics as such. Many of you would have heard about the North-South divide, the divide between the developing states and the developed world. Well, now a similar kind of a division is also being recreated in the cyberspace. So if you look at, for instance, the internet access, that is the basic in a sense, criteria for gauging a country's digital development. Internet access in the developed countries, it's almost 87%, right? So all the countries in North America, as well as Europe, as well as Australia, and some countries in East Asia, there are 87% of the population is connected to the internet. But if you look at the least developed countries, countries in Southeast Asia, as well as in Africa, and some parts of South America, it is just 19%. Right? So there's a huge divide in terms of who can come on the internet highway, who can benefit from this internet. And that is the digital divide, which basically defines the ability of the countries to respond to the technological challenges, the ability of the countries to respond to the emerging cyber threats. So now the north-south divide that you used to hear in the economic sphere is now being recast as a digital divide, which means if you 19% of the people in the LDCs are not getting access, which basically means almost 3 billion people still today don't have access to the internet. Right? 3 billion out of like 8.5 billion global population. And this is an important factor when we look at the geopolitics of cybersecurity. Today, countries are basically exploiting vulnerabilities and weaknesses in every country's computer networks to hack into their computer networks, steal important data. In the case of the companies and corporations, they're stealing their business plans, and also disrupt the critical infrastructure operations. What is critical infrastructure? As Purva was talking about in the introduction, what is critical infrastructure? Critical infrastructure is basically that infrastructure which needs to be operational 24/7, 365 days of the year. So imagine, for instance, power systems. Imagine, for instance, your water systems. Imagine, for instance, your traffic systems, your railway signaling systems, your air traffic control, nuclear plants, your banking system. These are the kind of systems which need to be operational and functional all the time. They cannot be disrupted. And if they're disrupted, and if they're disrupted for a longer period, then the society and the economy and the country faces many problems. And today, many adversarial states are exactly targeting the critical infrastructure of other countries. So they're targeting nuclear reactors, they're targeting oil pipelines, they're targeting power grids. And in many cases, what is happening is that there is a domino effect which happens. So for instance, if you look at the critical infrastructure, I would say power system is the most, I would say, the element, the basic of the critical infrastructure, because when there is an extended power blackout, that means, for instance, the metro systems will get disrupted. Okay, so your water systems also get disrupted because they don't have the access to power. So that is the kind of domino effect. In fact, in Delhi in 2012, when there was a similar kind of a power blackout, which actually went on for 2.5 days, the Delhi Metro's power backup, which was supposed to last for 48 hours, okay, they used it for 48 hours, and they could not come back online because there was no power. So then the Delhi Metro could not run. So that is the kind of domino effect which we talk about, and this is the kind of impact that the hackers are trying to achieve. And therefore, it is no wonder that all the major powers today have dedicated units which basically are only carrying out cyber attacks. But even as we look at the cyberspace and we look at the increasing number of cyber attacks, the last 3 years of the COVID-19 pandemic have really, in a sense, been an important development in the geopolitics of cyberspace, because even as the global attention was focused on tackling the pandemic, we had hospitals full of patients, we had, medicine shortages, we had oxygen cylinder shortages. When the world was grappling with those kind of challenges, there were some state actors as well as state-supported non-state actors, which were solely, carrying out cyber attacks, targeting hospitals, other kinds of health infrastructure, vaccine companies, and those kind of things. So even in these times of adversities, these hackers and other kinds of rogue actors, they found an opportunity to to execute the cyber attacks. And in that sense, what happened during the last COVID-19 pandemic was that attacks targeting the healthcare and the hospitals really went shot through the roof. And in doing so, the problem that is basic in the cyberspace, that problem comes to fore, which is the problem of attribution, which basically means, that unlike the physical attacks or the kinetic attacks, you can, after due investigation, do find out who was the perpetrator, who carried out the attack, who committed the crime. That is not really the case in the cyberspace. There is always a difficulty in identifying or clearly identifying who carried out the attack. And that, in a sense, is an advantageous position for the person or for the actor who carries out the attacks. So many states are actually taking advantage of the problem of attribution in executing the cyber attacks. Of course, over the last few years, there has been technical developments where countries are finding out how they are, or who has carried out the cyber attacks. But again, that is the capacity which many developed countries have. That is the capacity which is not there with many of the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Asia. But it is true that states are the ones which are the major executor of the cyber attacks. But there is one particular group which is basically also emerging as a non-state actor in the cyberspace, a very influential non-state actor in the cyberspace, and that is the Lazarus group. Lazarus group is basically a gang of criminals, okay, but they receive support from the North Korean regime. And since 2009, you can see, they have targeted so many countries for a variety of reasons. One major reason for their targeting is basically stealing the money. They basically target banks, financial institutions, and cryptocurrency exchanges with the sole purpose of carrying out theft. And it's interesting because that is supported with North Korea. As you would know, as the students of international politics would know, North Korea has been at the end of receiving sanctions for the last many years. And that has reduced or curtailed the ability of the North Korean regime to generate revenues. And by supporting this hacker group, Lazarus group, they are actually trying to generate revenue for their own operations. This Lazarus group targets the banks, steals money from the bank, and then gives it to the North Korean state. And that is how North Korean state is able to survive itself, and the regime survives on that kind of money. There's also now evidence which is saying that the money which has been used from these cyber crimes is also being funneled by North Korea into its missile and other kinds of nuclear weapons program. So that is how the non-state actors are now blurring the gap between the state actors. So even though the non-state actor like Lazarus group is carrying an attack, the main perpetrator is the North Korean state, right? So you cannot really say, that this is a non-state actor and this is a state actor. This is now blurring the distinction between the state actor and the non-state actor. And if you look at the history of the cyber attacks, this is how it has panned out. 2009 onwards, the major attack which was reported in the media was the Stuxnet virus. Designed by the United States and Israel, this particular malware targeted the Iranian nuclear program. Interesting because even though the target was the Iranian nuclear program, the virus, before reaching the target, traveled through 120 countries, including India, and then finally hit the target in 2010. The result was the Iranian nuclear reactors were slowed down, and that gave a setback to Iran's nuclear program, and that is how Iran's nuclear program was derailed. That was the sole intention of this Stuxnet virus. 2014, there was a data breach in the Sony Corporation's computer networks. It was carried out by the Lazarus group. Reason? Sony was actually producing a movie which was a satire movie on the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. So Sony Corporation faced a cyber attack from a North Korean backed Lazarus group. The group hacked into the systems of the Sony, stole Sony's all future business plans, and one movie which was not yet released. And therefore Sony had to shelve that particular movie's release. And plus, Sony also faced lawsuits from its employees for the breach of personal data. So even though someone else carried out the attack, Sony as a company had to bore the brunt of that particular cyber attack. Lazarus Group, as I talked about, was also targeting the banks. So in 2016, they targeted the Bangladesh Bank's account. Bangladesh Bank is the central bank of Bangladesh, just like our Reserve Bank of India. The Bangladesh Bank's account in the Federal Reserve of New York Bank, it was targeted by the Lazarus Group. They were trying to execute theft of almost $1 billion. They were successful in taking $100 million, and the rest of the $900 million could not be successful. Bangladesh Bank lost $100 million. They traced the money, but they were not able to recover the money. The money was actually traced back to a casino in Philippines, which was being used by the North Korean regime. So that is how the Lazarus Group was working on behalf of North Korea. And the latest attack, which happened was in 2021, was a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline. Now, Colonial Pipeline is like an oil pipeline which operates on United States West Coast and provides like 45 to 50% of the countries of the West Coast gas as well as oil. So when there was an attack or ransomware attack, the system was locked out. So Colonial Pipeline could not deliver oil to some of its customers, and that increased the fuel prices. Right? In some parts of the United States, the fuel prices almost doubled down. Right? So that is what happened in the case of the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, and that was a domino effect. So company faced cyber attack, its systems got locked, and therefore it could not deliver oil to its customers, and that shot the fuel prices in some parts of the United States. And as I said, ransomware is really now becoming a major threat, because criminals have realized that once companies' servers are locked, they become desperate, right? They want to resume operations as early as possible because they're also facing losses on other fronts, and plus also the wrath of the consumers. So they're willing to pay the ransom. Okay, so in many cases, the ransom is paid. The company does not talk about it, and the criminal gangs then resume their activities. And that is what is happening in most of the ransomware attacks. And that has, in a sense, given a birth to a ransomware industry, ransomware as a service. So now there are criminal gangs, and now there are middlemen of the criminal gangs who actually provide the ransomware, the virus, to other companies, who then target the other companies and then get the money. So interesting is, as these cyber attacks are increasing, there are many countries which have thought about, for instance, what to do, how to respond to the cyber attacks. Most of the times what we have seen is actually a retaliation for the cyber attacks within the cyberspace. So for instance, after the Stuxnet virus hit the Iranian nuclear program, Iranian hackers there was not yet clarity on who had carried out the attack. So Iran suspected the role of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so then Iranian hackers targeted a Saudi company, Saudi Aramco, which is the oil company, and they wiped out the data from 75% of the company's computer networks, right? So that was the kind of retaliation that we have seen in the cyberspace, a tit for tat kind of cyber attack. But now there are countries which are actually thinking, beyond the cyberspace, because the intensity of the cyber attacks and the disruption caused by cyber attacks is also increasing. Israeli military is one such example. So in May 2019, Israeli Defense Forces actually targeted the Hamas technology division, which was basically carrying out cyber attacks against the Israeli critical infrastructure. So they preempted a cyber attack by bombing this building of the Hamas technology division, and therefore that was a new kind of retaliation, a retaliation in the physical sphere that we had seen for the cyber attacks. But there are also other non-military, non-cyber attacks which have responses which have also come. Cyber sanctions is one such example. In 2017, the European Union developed EU diplomacy cyber diplomacy toolbox, which basically allowed the European Union and its member states to use all measures, including sanctions, to prevent, discourage, deter, and respond to malicious cyber activities against it. So these sanctions basically included asset freeze. It basically included restrictions on the EU nationals to commercially engage with the sanctioned entities and those kind of things. And in 2020, the European Union imposed the first set of sanctions against Russian and Chinese hackers for carrying out the cyber attacks. Now, taking a lead of the European Union, even the United States also developed its own regime, and they also targeted the Russian government for various kinds of malicious cyber activities. Even though these cyber sanctions have proved somewhat effective, one major weakness that they have faced and one major challenge they have faced is that it is not yet clear as to whether this has deterred the perpetrators or the other state actors from carrying out the cyber attacks. In fact, what we have seen is that as soon as the cyber sanctions are imposed, there is a retaliation which is coming from the Russian hackers, from the Chinese hackers, and from the North Korean hackers in response to those sanctions. So they just increase the tempo of their cyber activities against these sanctions. And in this context, it is interesting to look at what is happening in Ukraine conflict. As Purva mentioned, cyber attacks have become a part of the hybrid warfare. What is hybrid warfare? Hybrid warfare has a couple of features. One is the use of proxies. So all that we looked at, for instance, the use of non-state actors as proxy by the state actors, that is a characteristic of hybrid warfare. Use of advanced technologies, that is also characteristic of hybrid warfare. That is also evident in the case of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the third and most important is basically use of disinformation and propaganda. Right? So in case of Ukraine, we have seen Russia basically utilizing various elements of the hybrid warfare against the Ukrainian regime. In fact, days before the special military operation was launched by Russia against Ukraine, Ukrainian officials actually faced a barrage of cyber attacks coming in from the Russian hackers against the government ministries and banks, as well as media and other kinds of websites, which basically disrupted their services for a few hours. With this was also the disinformation campaigns, and disinformation campaigns basically spread confusion about what was really happening on the ground. One example is basically there's a new technology called as the deep fake technology. Deep fake basically what does is that it generates new videos which are artificial videos, but they have a fake content. So Russian hackers actually circulated a video of Ukrainian President Zelensky announcing surrender to the Russian forces on the social media, right? So that kind of video was circulated by the Russian hackers in the social media, and that caused chaos and confusion. But that is what the disinformation does, and that is what the deep fake videos does. Imagine today, for instance, and in fact, there is in the United States now. There's a very interesting thing which is happening, that now former President Donald Trump has been indicted for the criminal conspiracy. So one of the cybersecurity researchers 3 weeks ago actually asked AI, artificial intelligence, to recreate images or create images or imagine images of how Trump will be arrested. Okay, and AI generated those pictures, and he put them out on Twitter with a disclaimer saying, this is how AI works. These are not real images. But you know how social media works. Like someone took those images and put them out and saying, that Trump has been arrested, and that caused its own this thing. So that's what the deep fake and AI enabled technology does. And it is in this global context, India has positioned itself as a country which has a leading IT base, information technology base, but also we are utilizing digital public goods or digital public infrastructure such as CoWIN, India Stack, Aadhaar, and we want to export it to the world. As Purva mentioned, we have more than 700 million internet users in India. I'm sure many of you would have received an email like this, asking for some details and then promising you some information. Now, many of you are laughing, because you know that this is a fake email, right? But imagine this condition 13 years ago, when you receive this kind of email offering some kind of finance and some kind of money, many Indians actually responded to this kind of email. And actually there were consequences. As per one report, in 2013, around $12 billion were lost to these kind of fraudsters, or what we used to call as Nigerian phishing emails, with a total loss of around $82 billion so far. Why did it matter to India? Because India was one of the top 5 growing markets for these kind of email frauds. And in 2013, Indians lost almost $900 million to this kind of fraud. Okay. Now, of course, we receive these kind of emails. Therefore, we know, that these are fake emails. So now even the fraudsters are shifted to the mobile phones. So sometimes you will get a message saying, that you have won a lottery, and can you submit your financial details, and therefore that kind of thing. So that is how, cyber technology and cyber saboteurs are advancing their tactics. But parallel to this social engineering attacks was also the emergence of the threat coming in from our two adversaries, Pakistan and China. From Pakistan, the major threat in the initial days was basically hacking and defacing of the Indian websites. Many of the times these were tit for tat attacks. So a group of hackers, Indian hackers, would go and deface Pakistani website and put pro-India content. Then you'd have a retaliatory attack coming from the Pakistani hackers on the Indian websites, and that is how the thing used to going on. What I used to call as nuisance value attacks. But over a period of time, these attacks have really evolved to become far more penetrating and far more advanced. These attacks are basically now targeting senior Indian government officials, military personnel, to basically extract information. One such case was recently detected by a malware known as Reverse Rat 2.0, and that basically targeted the Indian government officials by sending them a fake link for a Zoom meeting from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Okay, so they said, that this is a meeting being organized by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Please join this link and join this meeting. And if anyone clicked on that link, a malware was installed on that particular person's computer, and then once it breached the system, the malware could remotely click photographs via the webcams or take the information from the USB drives, as well as spread it further, clone it further. So that is how Pakistani threat has evolved in the last few years. But the most dangerous threat comes from China, and it is basically targeting the critical infrastructure, espionage, and those kind of things. In fact, one of the most prominent cyber attack prior to this current round of cyber attacks coming in from China was APT-30. APT basically means Advanced Persistent Threat. Advanced Persistent Threat basically means that a virus sits in your computer and sits in a computer undetected for a very long period of time, utilizing all the system's vulnerabilities. So this particular virus, APT-30, was discovered in 2015. When it was discovered, it was found out that the virus was sitting in the system for 10 years. Oh, and it was basically taking out information from the Indian computer networks and sending it to China. This computer, and that is how basically prompted then National Security Advisor M.K. Narayanan to say that the computers of the Prime Minister's office are infected. I have a laptop which has been infected by the Chinese hackers. So that really forced him to make that kind of statement. But that statement is just one of the few attributions that India has made officially when it comes to China or Pakistan. So despite facing so many attacks from China and Pakistan, Indian government or Indian government officials have not publicly attributed a cyber attack to Pakistan or China. I can only note two attributions. One was this statement coming in from then NSA, M.K. Narayanan, and the other was during the blackout that we faced in Mumbai when Maharashtra's energy minister spoke about a Chinese malware being inserted into the power grids. So those are the only two attributions that the government officials have made when they talk about the role of China. One of the other recent attacks from China was basically targeting the two vaccine makers, Bharat Biotech and the Serum Institute of India. And it's interesting because they're targeting the vaccine makers, because these vaccines have played a role in our own domestic vaccination program, but also India's vaccine diplomacy known as Vaccine Maitri. Why would the Chinese hackers target the vaccine makers? One theory is that it is basically commercial espionage. Because if you look at the Indian vaccine, AstraZeneca or Covishield, marketed as Covishield here, but marketed as AstraZeneca worldwide, that vaccine is being used in more than 120 countries. Okay, it has an effectiveness of 95% plus. Chinese flagship vaccine Sinopharm is basically used in 90 countries, okay, and has a vaccine effectiveness of only 65% plus. So that means that the Chinese hackers are trying to target the Indian vaccine makers, and by targeting also look at whether they can get access to that kind of formula which the Indian vaccine makers are using and take it back to the Chinese companies so that they can improvise their own vaccine. Apart from Pakistan and China, India has also been at the receiving end of other state-sponsored operations. I talked about the North Korean Lazarus group. The Lazarus group has also targeted some of the Indian banks, including a Cosmos Bank, the Pune-based Cosmos Bank in 2018. In this attack, Cosmos Bank lost around 94 crore rupees through the ATMs and online transfers. Again, that money was never recovered. The other attack that the state-sponsored operation that India has faced is from the United States through their PRISM surveillance program. Even though, again, there is some, should I say, some amount of ambiguity on that particular attack, on that particular operation, because the US officials as well as Indian officials justified that particular surveillance because of the counterterrorism needs of India. That much of the surveillance which has been carried out by the National Security Agency was against the targets which India had identified. But nonetheless, when the revelations came from Edward Snowden, it basically said, that India was the 5th most surveilled upon country by the United States PRISM surveillance program. Another significant aspect of the India's cyber threat landscape is basically cyber terrorism. So we have anti-India terrorist groups which are based in Pakistan, such as Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. They have used social media platforms for radicalization, propaganda, and recruitment. In fact, besides these Pakistan-based groups, we also have the pan-Islamic groups, the global pan-Islamic groups such as the Daesh or the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, which have also utilized cyberspace for targeting the terror suspects here. In fact, between 2014 and 17, the Daesh's propaganda influenced some of the Indian elements of Indian population so much that some of the Indian youth actually traveled to Iraq and Syria to fight with the Islamic State there. And therefore, countering that particular propaganda has also emerged as a challenge for the Indian security establishment. A related challenge of this, which I talked about, was the disinformation. In fact, fake news and disinformation campaigns coming in from China and Pakistan have really emerged as a major challenge. For example, after August 2019, when India basically created the two new union territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, there was a barrage of social media propaganda coming in from the Pakistani trolls targeting India. It talked about, for instance, there is a fake profile being created of a CRPF official who talked about how there was a mass rebellion within CRPF ranks in protest against the Indian government's decision. There are videos being put out about how there were protest demonstrations in Srinagar and other parts of Kashmir targeting the Indian security forces. And also efforts to spread fake news about the various developments in Kashmir. So that is how Pakistan's disinformation machinery has really worked against India. Now, talking about the critical infrastructure, and I talk about the Stuxnet virus. I said that before targeting the Iranian nuclear program, the virus traveled through many countries. The virus also traveled through India. And India was the 3rd largest victim of the Stuxnet virus. We had infections of ONGC facility here as well as some of the oil pipelines in Haryana. These were minor infections, but the fact that this virus spread through the network so fast, and that was really a concern for the Indian policymakers, because that in a sense showed the vulnerability of the Indian critical infrastructure for these kind of attacks targeting the critical infrastructure. And therefore, as a result, in 2014, Indian government set up a National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, and that has now really become the backbone for India's critical infrastructure. Talking about the digital payment systems, you and me, we use UPI every day. We use our debit cards, ATM cards for digital payment systems, but even as some of us are becoming victims of these micro-level cyber crimes, there is also a larger thing which is being played out, where again, as I said, groups like Lazarus groups are targeting the payment systems. In 2016, we had an attack, a malware attack on the Hitachi payment services in India. And that time, that particular attack cost India 1.3 crore of economic loss. And it also forced 19 major Indian banks, both in the public as well as the private sector, to replace their ATM and debit cards. Such was the extent of that particular malware attack. And till date, we don't know whether it was a state-sponsored attack or whether it was any cyber criminal gang which was targeting the Hitachi payment services. Another serious attack was on the Union Bank of India in 2016, when a malware breached the bank's servers and gained access to its foreign account for foreign currency payment systems. And therefore, it allowed the hackers to take almost $170 million from the Union Bank and transfer it abroad. Fortunately, with timely intervention and with cooperation with SWIFT. SWIFT basically regulates the interbanking payment transactions. We were able to recover all that money. But as I've said, that in some cases the money is lost forever. I mentioned about the Cosmos Bank losing 94 crores in that particular attack by the Lazarus group. This is interesting. Okay, so much of what I talked about is basically the surface internet, right? The internet that you and me access every day. But that is just a 25% of the internet. 75% of the internet is basically your deep web. This deep web, which basically is you and me cannot access most of the times. This deep web also has content which cannot be found on the Google's searches or any other kind of search engines. And a tiny part of it is a dark web, which is basically criminal elements using that internet for perpetuating their criminal activities. This dark web or dark net is accessible through a technology called as the onion router. That's why the onion there. This onion router technology, basically, if you look at the onion, it has different layers. So as you peel the layers, you will go to the core of it. So similar kind of the Tor technology, which basically does is that it hides your internet traffic. It hides your location. So typically speaking, your phone, your iPad, your laptop, has an IP address, internet protocol address. So in any cyber criminal investigation, once the police get access to that IP address, they are able to do many things. But the Tor technology hides your IP address. That's it. So therefore it makes you anonymous in the cyberspace. And after that you can do anything. And that is how the technology is being misused. Of course, there's also the positive use of the technology. So there are many whistleblowers, there are many human rights activists which have used the technology to basically spread out a word about all the kinds of criminal activities and injustices which are happening in their particular country and report it to the outside world, because they are able to do that because their location is hidden. But the negative use of is by the criminal elements, because again their network, their location is hidden, and therefore they can engage in all kinds of criminal activities. For India, I have identified three threats from these darknet marketplaces, or what I call as digital black markets. First is the flourishing online drug trade. Almost 90% of the material which is being sold on the darknet marketplaces is basically your drugs and narcotic substances. So these are some of the snapshots of the two websites, which are basically, you can see they're actually selling some of the Indian goods on this particular thing. Interesting thing is that it is being sold not just to the users abroad, but also to the users in India. Okay, and if you now link it to the physical world, if you look at India's location today, India actually sits in the middle of the two drug trading hubs. You have Golden Crescent, which is basically Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran on India's west, and then you have a Golden Triangle, which is your Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Right? These are the two drug producing hubs that India is located in, and this kind of online drug sale basically perpetuates that offline drug smuggling. So that's the first major threat. The second major threat is basically the abatement to cyber crimes. So if you go to these darknet marketplaces, and if you search, for instance, Aadhaar, if you search, for instance, passport, if you, for instance, search for PAN card, you will get data sets, okay, with all sorts of personal information being sold for tiniest amounts of money. There is a report which says that all your health related information, which is now I'm linking back to the AIMS malware attack, all the health related information is being sold for $250 per record, okay, as against this information such as passport, PAN card, which is being sold by $40. Okay, that's why the attack on the AIMS. Okay, AIMS being used by all the top political leaders, by the top civil servant officials. Okay, anyone who gets access to that kind of data is a rich person, because then anyone who gets access to the data can actually develop patterns, can know many things. One example which I can cite is that, for instance, if they can access the patient's records of all the top politicians, they would know that anyone who is being projected as a future leader actually has so many health vulnerabilities that he or she cannot live beyond 15 years, and therefore the political parties are not even considering as a future leader, right? So those kind of things, they are doing by accessing this kind of data. And the third one is the catalyst for terrorist activities. As I said, that these dark net marketplaces have 90% of the things which are narcotic substances, but in Europe and in some parts of North America, even small arms and firearms and guns and rifles are being sold through the online space. And there are reports which suggest that some of the attacks which have been carried out by the Islamic State lone wolves, the individual terrorists, they have actually accessed the weapons by buying them on the darknet platforms. In case of India, what we have seen is that there are specific instructions which are being passed because it hides your internet protocol location, address, as well as it makes you anonymous, and therefore Tor actually enables you to escape the security forces surveillance. So there are instructions being passed out by this group such as the Ansar Ghazwatul Hind. Ansar Ghazwatul Hind is basically a franchisee of the Al-Qaeda operating in Kashmir. They are specifically passing on instructions to their terrorists in Kashmir to say, please make use of the VPN, please make use of the Tor so that you can escape the security surveillance. Always use the encrypted apps. So that is how, the terrorist threat gets amplified, because terrorists get access to these advanced technologies and therefore they are able to carry out their activities much more freely. So you would now ask, so what is India doing? Well, in the last few years, India has really made cybersecurity as a policy priority. In fact, we were one of the first countries to really enact an Information Technology Act way back in 2008, and which was then 2002, and which was then amended in 2008. In 2013, we brought out a national cybersecurity policy, which basically tried to bring all the stakeholders on one page. And we have also created in 2015, the government appointed a national cybersecurity coordinator who would, in a sense, work with all the security agencies, technical agencies, as well as the law enforcement agencies to work on the national cybersecurity issues. And as I said, that the government also set up the NCIIPC for the critical infrastructure protection. But besides that, various ministries have also, established their own dedicated cybersecurity units. So, for instance, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology has what is called as CERT-IN, which is basically Computer Emergency Response Team. If you go to Computer Emergency Response Team's website, you would see multiple advisories being circulated by that particular department of what kind of viruses which are being in use, what kind of malware which are being detected in other countries' computer networks, and therefore the Indian users should be aware of those kind of viruses. National Informatics Center also tries to firewall the entire internet traffic for India. We have CDAC, which is also working on some of the encrypted apps as well as hardware, and UIDI, which basically does protects all the Aadhaar related data. So they have one data center in Gurgaon and one data center at an undisclosed location, so that there is a mirroring of data. So for instance, for any reason the data center in Gurgaon gets attacked and it gets shut down, we still have access to all the Aadhaar data. Minister of Finance, REBIT. So Reserve Bank of India has also set up its own cybersecurity entity called as REBIT, which basically looks at the cybersecurity of all the digital payment systems. So again, REBIT from time to time has been doing an audit for all the scheduled banks, for all the commercial banks, as well as what we call as the prepaid payment instrument, or your mobile wallets, your Paytm, and those kind of things, Ola Cash and those kind of things, so that they can also, use some of the cyber security standards which have been laid out by the Reserve Bank of India. Ministry of Home Affairs has set up now Indian Cyber Crime Coordination Center, which basically again looks at all the cyber criminal issues and also works with the police stations to solve many cyber criminal investigation cases. And in 2019, India set up a defense cyber agency. So as I said, that many militaries around the world have now set up dedicated units for cyber operations. So even the Ministry of Defense has now set up its own agency called as Defense Cyber Agency, which basically brings out all the three services, Indian Army, Indian Air Force and Indian Navy under one head, and they can carry out the cyber operations together as well as protect the military computer networks. But even as we do this, there are many challenges which are there. And one challenge which is not just unique to the cyberspace, in fact, it's bane of any security establishment, not just in India but all over the world, is the turf battles between the security agencies. There is still no clarity as to who really guards the cyberspace. So, for instance, sometimes the Ministry of Home Affairs thinks that, that it is guarding the cyberspace. Sometimes the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology says they are the ones who are defending the cyberspace. Sometimes it is the Indian military, and there is still no clarity as to who should be the primary defender of the Indian cyberspace. But that is because these agencies themselves have not been able to resolve their differences. Second is insufficient cyber hygiene, as what Purvam was mentioning in her introduction. We have 700 plus million internet users, and as I said, they're not digital natives. They're the first generation internet users. They lack a knowledge about do's and don'ts. Okay, and this lack of awareness manifest in multiple things. As I said, sometimes they end up becoming the victims of the cybercrime because they respond to these phishing emails. But sometimes it also, in a sense, works out in the disinformation space. So anything which you receive on WhatsApp, you will forward it, and therefore contribute to the fake news and disinformation, because the users themselves are not really aware about what is a genuine content, what is a real news, what is genuine news, and what is the fake news. And it also manifests in some other spaces, which is basically all the cyber trolling, all the cyber doxing and cyber bullying that you see in the cyberspace, right? That is also where the manifestation comes in. I was part of one of the projects recently where I presented where I worked with a member of parliament to create a digital civics bill, which basically combined the elements of cyber hygiene, which basically means what you should be aware of when it comes to the cyberspace, but also be a responsible cyber citizen. So that it basically means that you do not engage in cyber trolling, you do not bully anyone on the cyberspace, you do not post anyone's personal information in the cyberspace, what we call as doxing. So you do not, for instance, post anyone's personal phone number, email address, and those kind of things. So I was working with a member of parliament to create this digital civics bill. So that's the second challenge in the insufficient cyber hygiene. And third actually goes back to the dilemma of international politics. Do morals really matter in international politics? What it means to be a moral country. And as I said, that since many countries are using malicious cyber activities to fulfill their geopolitical rivalries, India also faces the same choice. That if today you have an attack coming in from the Chinese hackers, do you go and retaliate and then carry out a similar kind of attack on the Chinese hackers? Okay, there is a certain moral dilemma associated with that. If there is an attack, let's say, on our own healthcare systems coming in from the Chinese hackers, do we go back and attack a Chinese hospital, right, in the cyberspace? Those are the kind of moral dilemmas which are there. To a certain extent, we have seen recently that India has really amped up its cyber offensive operations, which is why we have now reports coming in from the Chinese Global Times, which have accused India of carrying out the cyber attacks targeting the Chinese education institutions and other kinds of computer networks. So in a sense, that this dilemma remains. Should we commit? It's the same kind of dilemma in the physical space. Should you respond to violence through a violent mean? Right? So similar kind of things. So should we respond to a cyber attack with a similar kind of a devastating cyber attack? And that remains a moral challenge, and that remains one of the primary challenges when it comes to responding to some of the cyber incidents. Finally, India's cyber diplomacy. So as I said, India has emerged as an information technology power, and India is doing a lot when it comes to cybersecurity, and therefore it is very keen to project that kind of experience at the global level. And it is in three ways that it is doing this. One is the creation of cyber norms. As I said, there are certain norms when it comes to your physical battle space. For instance, there is the Geneva Convention, right? In the cyberspace, there is no accepted agreement amongst the states on what is cybersecurity. Should we be engaging on cybersecurity cooperation? So therefore, India, what India is doing is that it is proposing various kinds of cyber norms for responsible state behavior. One of the norms that it is proposing is that states undertake not to attack each other's critical infrastructure. Okay, that's one. Second, that states will undertake not to carry out an attack which will have a physical consequence or a civilian casualty. Right? Those kind of things India is proposing. But of course, when India does that, as I said, even though India has emerged as an IT power, it sits in the middle in many things. It's part of the global south because it is a developing economy, but when it comes to the IT power, it is actually does better than the developed world, and therefore it sits in the middle of the global north and the global south. It also sits in the middle, interestingly, in the cyberspace today, because today's cyberspace is actually divided into two blocks. Where we have a Western bloc, which is led by the United States and the European countries, and they talk about a rules-based order in the cyberspace. And there is an Eastern camp led by China and Russia, which, in a sense, have their own vision of the cyberspace. India is part of neither of those camps. India sits in the middle of that particular thing. So when it talks about many of these issues, there's a push and pull of these things. So one pull is of economic development, in a sense, that India realizes the benefits which arise from the cyber technology when it comes to the economic development, but there's also pressure of national security. Interesting thing is, if you look at, for instance, there is a talk about the free flow of data. The data should freely flow across the countries. For a very long time, India actually opposed that principle. Why? Because when it came to cyber crimes, Indian security agencies faced a problem in terms of gathering the evidence, because most of the times the data was actually residing on a foreign server, and Indian security agencies were not getting timely access to that particular data. And therefore, when it came to free flow of data, India said no. Any data which concerns Indian citizens should be residing on the Indian territory. What we in the cyberspace call as data localization. The data should be stored locally. And that is how the pull of economic development and the pressure of national security is there. The second is managing the internet governance. Now, the internet that you and me see every day, that there is a body which actually manages that. It's called as ICANN. It manages your websites and those kind of things. So for a very long time, India had opposed multinationalization of that particular body, because that body was controlled by the United States, and when United States gave up the control, it wanted to open it to entire civil society. India actually opposed that for a very long time, but then ultimately it came around the model of multi-stakeholder, which was advocated by the United States. But again, that also became a reflection of India's own domestic experience, because if you look at today's technical policy on cybersecurity policy that India formulates, we have a very thriving domestic ecosystem. We have human rights organizations, we have various NGOs, we have various organizations representing the legal community, and we have the think tanks such as ORF, which are contributing to the policy making. So India actually took that model and said, that okay, we support a multi-stakeholder model even at the international level. And finally, the emphasis on capacity building. India realizes, that it has the capacity, somewhat limited capacity, to fight the cyber crime and face off the cyber threats, but many countries don't have that kind of capacity. So what can we do? So the best is actually focus on cooperation with these countries and give them that know-how, give them that knowledge, give them the technical awareness of those kind of things. So it on a regular basis cooperates with the national computer emergency response teams, with the local law enforcement agencies of the other countries, and it also gives the training in cybersecurity. In fact, our flagship economic aid program, foreign aid program called as ITEC, Indian Technology and Economic Cooperation Program. Now under that ITEC program, we are actually imparting knowledge on cybersecurity and emerging technologies to the foreign countries' government officials. So we have foreign government officials coming and sitting in IIT Kharagpur, IIT Bombay, IIT Delhi, who are taking courses on cybersecurity and emerging technologies and taking that understanding back to their home countries, so that they can also have those capacities to fight those cyber threats. Finally, this is a shameless plug, sorry, but as Purva said, this is my book, Securing India in the Cyber Era. It was published last year, and many of the things that I actually discuss are in this particular book. Thank you.